The silence in Alistair Finch's penthouse was not a peaceful one. It was a manufactured, oppressive quiet, the kind that costs millions to achieve. It was the silence of triple-paned glass that turned the roaring metropolis below into a muted, glittering tapestry, a world seen but not heard. It was the silence of thick, sound-dampening walls and floors of polished Italian marble, so vast and seamless they seemed to swallow every footstep. For Elena Vance, the silence was a constant, physical pressure against her eardrums, a reminder of the gilded cage she inhabited 6 days a week. From her position on the floor of the child's playroom, the city lights looked like a galaxy of distant, unreachable stars. The air itself smelled sterile, a mixture of expensive cleaning solutions and the faint, almost imperceptible scent of leather and steel that emanated from the rest of the apartment. Every surface gleamed with an impersonal perfection, from the chrome legs of the minimalist furniture to the stark white walls that held no family photos, no art, no warmth. It was less a home and more a monument to a man's power, a cold, sterile fortress built high above the struggles of the common world, a world Elena knew all too well. Elena, in her simple gray uniform, was designed to be as unobtrusive as the decor. She moved with a quiet efficiency that had been perfected over years of service jobs. Her presence meant to be felt only in its results: a tidy room, a prepared meal, a silent, supervised child. But beneath this placid surface, a universe of thought and memory churned. Her mind was a library of academic journals, a catalog of pediatric psychological theories, a place where the echoes of university lecture halls still resonated with a painful clarity. Every moment she spent in this cold, empty fortress was a direct consequence of a world that had been stolen from her. The constant, low-grade hum of anxiety in her stomach was a familiar companion, a cold knot that tightened whenever she thought of the mounting bills for her father's care. His face, once vibrant with intellectual curiosity, now a pale mask in a long-term care facility, was the image seared behind her eyelids. It was for him that she endured this invisibility, for him that she swallowed her pride and answered to a man who saw her as nothing more than a cog in his domestic machine. Her life had become a stark duality: the competent, silent governess on the outside, and the grieving, brilliant daughter of a ruined genius on the inside, waiting for a moment she wasn't even sure would ever come. The objects spread before her on the plush white rug were not mere toys. To an outside observer, it was a simple scene: a woman and a child playing with wooden blocks and textured squares of fabric. But for Elena, this was surgery of the mind. Each block, each piece of silk or rough-hewn burlap, was a carefully chosen instrument in a delicate procedure she knew intimately. This was her father's life's work, a groundbreaking methodology for treating selective mutism, built not on medication or force, but on trust and nonverbal communication. She could almost feel his presence beside her, his gentle voice explaining the principles in their warm, cluttered clinic, a place that smelled of old books and chamomile tea. He believed that a child's silence was not an absence of language, but a fortress built to protect something fragile. The key was not to storm the walls, but to be invited inside. As she slowly slid a smooth, cool piece of blue silk toward the small, unmoving hand of Lily Finch, she remembered her father's words. Let the texture speak first. Let the color ask the question. Let the silence be a shared space, not an empty one. This expertise, the very knowledge that Alistair Finch had stolen and buried, was her only true possession, a secret weapon hidden in plain sight, wielded now in the heart of her enemy's fortress to save his own child. The serene atmosphere in the playroom was shattered not by a sound but by a shift in the air, a subtle change in pressure that announced his arrival. The whisper-quiet hum of the private elevator, the soft, authoritative click of the penthouse door closing, these were the heralds of Alistair Finch. He moved through his home not like a resident, but like a visiting monarch inspecting his domain. His footsteps were measured and heavy on the marble, each one a declaration of ownership. The scent of his cologne, a sharp, expensive fragrance of bergamot and cedar, preceded him, an olfactory announcement of power that invaded the space long before he did. Elena felt a familiar tension coil in her shoulders, a learned response to his presence. He was a man who radiated a chilling aura of transactional energy. He did not interact, he assessed. His gaze swept over rooms and people with the same detached calculation, evaluating their worth, their utility, their compliance. He was the embodiment of the world that had crushed her father, a world where empathy was a liability and human lives were entries on a balance sheet. His very presence made the air colder, the beautiful view from the window suddenly seeming more like a tactical advantage point than a simple panorama. He appeared in the doorway of the playroom, a towering silhouette against the bright lights of the hall. His suit was a masterpiece of dark gray wool, tailored so perfectly it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin, an armor against the imperfections of the world. But the flawless exterior could not conceal the storm brewing in his eyes. A vein throbbed at his temple, and his jaw was set in a line of rigid frustration. It was the look he wore after every failed appointment, with yet another world-renowned specialist, another expert his millions had bought who had failed to fix his broken daughter. His eyes, the color of cold steel, fell upon the scene on the floor. He saw Elena, the maid, the governess, the insignificant employee, sitting on his expensive rug. He saw his silent daughter Lily, her small hand hovering just inches from a piece of colored fabric Elena was offering. He did not see therapy. He did not see a breakthrough. He saw his servant, overstepping her bounds. He saw incompetence and a pathetic, folksy attempt to solve a problem that the best minds in the world could not crack. The frustration from his day, the deep, narcissistic wound of his daughter's imperfection, needed a target, and it found one in the quiet woman on the floor. The words, when they came, were not shouted. They were delivered in a low, controlled tone that dripped with condescension, each syllable a precisely aimed dart. He stepped into the room, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the pristine white carpet, a dark intrusion into the small, safe world Elena had built. He gestured dismissively at the blocks and fabrics scattered on the floor, a flick of his wrist that communicated more contempt than 1,000 insults. He told her she was paid to maintain the child's environment, to clean her messes, to ensure she was fed, not to engage in some kind of amateur, half-baked psychological experiment. He called her methods Maid's psychology, a pathetic attempt to play doctor by someone whose only qualification was knowing how to operate a washing machine. He informed her that he had just spent $50,000 on a consultation with a doctor from Zurich, and that her unqualified nonsense was not only useless, but potentially damaging. All the while, his eyes never truly met hers. They were fixed on a point just over her shoulder, as if she were a piece of furniture, an object unworthy of direct engagement. At his feet, Lily flinched, her small body curling inward, the fortress of her silence reinforced by the cold, hard stones of her own father's fury. As Alistair Finch's venomous monologue washed over her, something inside Elena shifted. The familiar knot of anxiety in her stomach did not tighten, it solidified. A cold, quiet fury, sharp and clear as ice, began to crystallize in her veins. It was a feeling she had not allowed herself to experience for years, a rage she had carefully packed away with her textbooks and her dreams. His words, meant to humiliate, did something else entirely. They stripped away the veneer of the quiet, compliant governess and reconnected her to the core of who she was. He wasn't just insulting her, he was desecrating her father's memory. As he mocked her methods, a vivid image flashed in her mind. Her father in his hospital bed, his brilliant eyes clouded with confusion, his once eloquent hands trembling as he struggled to hold a plastic cup. The man standing before her, in all his arrogant glory, was the architect of that devastation. The injustice of it all, the sheer crushing weight of it did not break her. It forged her. Her hands, resting on the carpet, became perfectly still. Her breathing, which should have hitched with fear or shame, grew slow and steady. In that moment of absolute degradation, her mission, once a vague hope for survival, was ignited into a singular, unwavering purpose. He thought he was silencing a maid, but he was awakening a warrior. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. With a final, contemptuous sniff, Alistair turned and walked away, leaving a chasm of cold silence in his wake. The echo of his pronouncements hung in the air, a toxic fog that settled over the playroom. Elena remained motionless for a long moment, the controlled calm of her fury holding her rigid. Then, slowly, she exhaled. She looked down at Lily, whose face was now buried in her knees, a tiny ball of fear and retreat. The tentative progress of the afternoon, the delicate bridge of trust she had been building, had been carpet-bombed by Alistair's rage. Gently, Elena began to gather the wooden blocks and fabric squares, her movements deliberate and precise. Each object felt heavy in her hands, no longer tools of healing but remnants of a failed skirmish. But as she placed the last block into its box, her eyes fell upon her own reflection in the vast floor-to-ceiling window. She saw the gray uniform, the tired lines around her eyes, the facade of the humble servant. But looking deeper, she saw something else flicker in her gaze, a glint of steel, a resolve that had been tempered in the fires of his scorn. He had made a fatal error. He had mistaken her patience for weakness and her silence for submission. He could not possibly know that in his attempt to put her in her place, he had just shown her exactly where she needed to stand. Later that same day, an unnerving stillness had once again descended upon the penthouse, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was the tense, charged silence that precedes a storm, thick with unspoken resentments and the lingering acid of Alistair Finch's earlier tirade. He sat in his cavernous study, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, the ice clinking like a distant, mournful bell. The city lights below, once a symbol of his dominion, now seemed to mock him, a million tiny points of life and connection that felt utterly alien to the sterile isolation of his world. His mind was a tempest of frustration. The failure of the Zurich specialist was a personal affront, a crack in the armor of his omnipotence. But beneath that anger was a deeper, colder fear he refused to name. The fear that his daughter, his own blood, was a flawed asset, a problem his vast fortune could not solve. He had decided with the cold finality of a corporate restructuring that the governess had to go. She was a loose end, a reminder of his inadequacy, and her presence was an irritation he would no longer tolerate. He would sever her from his life, pay her off, and find another, more compliant functionary to manage the silent, broken piece of his legacy. The decision brought him no peace, only a grim, hollow satisfaction as he rose from his leather chair, the glass still in hand, and began the short walk down the marble hall to deliver the final verdict. As he approached the playroom, his footsteps were heavy with intent, each one a hammer blow meant to shatter the last vestiges of the woman's employment. He was rehearsing the words in his mind, a cold, efficient script of termination. There would be no room for argument, no space for emotion. It would be a simple transaction, the end of a service contract. But as he drew nearer, a sound reached him that was so alien, so utterly out of place in the mausoleum of his home, that he stopped dead in the hallway. It was a whisper. Not the sound of the wind against the thick glass or the hum of the climate control system, but a human whisper, soft and melodic. It was a sound of intimacy, of gentle secrets being shared, a sound that had not graced these sterile walls in years. For a moment his logical mind tried to dismiss it. Perhaps it was the television, or a sound carrying from another apartment, an impossibility he knew even as he thought it. He stood frozen, his hand still gripping the cold glass, every nerve ending straining to identify the source of this auditory anomaly, this trespass against the suffocating silence he had so carefully curated. The sound was a ripple in a stagnant pond, and it drew him forward with a reluctant, almost fearful curiosity, pulling him toward the partially open door of his daughter's room. He moved with a predator's stealth, placing his feet silently on the cold marble, his earlier resolve momentarily forgotten, replaced by a raw, investigative urgency. He peered through the crack in the door, his world narrowing to the sliver of light and life within. The scene was almost identical to the one that had ignited his fury hours before. Elena was on the floor, her back to him, her simple gray uniform a stark contrast to the brilliant white of the rug. Before her sat Lily, her small form perfectly still, her eyes fixed on Elena's face with an intensity Alistair had never witnessed. The room was bathed in the soft, warm light of a single lamp, creating an island of intimacy in the vast, cold apartment. Elena was leaning forward, her voice the source of the impossible whisper he had heard. She wasn't speaking to Lily in the condescending, high-pitched tones of other nannies and therapists. Her voice was low, calm, and rhythmic, a gentle current of sound that seemed to flow around the child without demanding a response. He could not make out the words, but the tone was one of profound, unconditional acceptance. She was not trying to force a reaction. She was simply sharing a space, filling the silence not with pressure, but with peace. It was a portrait of connection, so pure and so foreign to his own experience that it felt like a painting from another world. Then, as he watched, his breath caught in his throat, a sharp, painful intake of air that seemed to vacuum all the oxygen from the hallway. He saw Elena pause her soft whispering. She held up one of the simple wooden blocks, turning it slowly in her hands. She did not push it toward Lily or ask her to take it. She simply presented it, an offering without expectation. And then, the impossible happened. The miracle he had spent millions chasing, the breakthrough the world's greatest minds had failed to deliver, unfolded in the quiet lamplight of the playroom. Lily, his silent, unreachable daughter, who had not uttered a single, coherent sound in over 3 years, lifted her small hand. She reached out, not for the block, but toward the woman who held it. Her lips parted, and a sound, fragile as a bird's wing yet clearer than any bell, emerged from the fortress of her silence. It was a single word. A name. Elena. It was not a question, not a plea, but a statement. A simple, profound act of recognition. The sound was a key, turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for 1,000 days. And in that instant, the entire foundation of Alistair Finch's world began to crumble into dust. The impact of that single word was not emotional, it was physical. A seismic shockwave that traveled up his spine and exploded in his brain. The polished marble floor seemed to tilt violently beneath his feet, the straight, clean lines of the hallway warping and bending as if seen through a heat haze. The expensive glass in his hand slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, shattering against the floor with a sound that was both deafeningly loud and impossibly distant. He stumbled backward, his hand flying out to brace himself against the cold, unyielding wall. A roaring sound filled his ears, like the rush of a tidal wave, drowning out the city, the silence, and the echo of his daughter's voice. He slid down the wall, his perfectly tailored suit crumpling, his legs no longer capable of supporting the weight of his own body. He landed in a heap on the floor, surrounded by the glittering shards of broken glass, his mind a maelstrom of cognitive dissonance. Everything he believed, every principle upon which he had built his empire and his life, was a lie. Money had not worked, power had not worked. Threats and influence and the cold, hard logic of acquisition had all failed. A maid, a nobody, a woman he had verbally eviscerated just hours before, had succeeded with nothing more than a whisper and a block of wood. His mind, a finely tuned machine for calculation and control, frantically tried to process the new data, but it was like trying to run a complex algorithm on a shattered computer. The image of Elena's calm face, the sound of Lily's voice saying her name, the memory of the $50,000 Zurich specialist shaking his head with clinical pity, These inputs collided with a violent, system-crashing force. How was this possible? What trickery was this? His brain, seeking a logical, controllable explanation, immediately veered toward suspicion. This couldn't be a breakthrough. It had to be a manipulation. The woman must have done something. Used some kind of cheap, psychological parlor trick to fool a vulnerable child. The thought took root in the fertile ground of his wounded pride, a poisonous seed that began to sprout with terrifying speed. The initial shock, the awe, the flicker of something that might have been hope, was instantly and violently extinguished, replaced by the familiar, comforting heat of rage. Rage was an emotion he understood. Rage was an emotion he could control. He was not a failed father witnessing a miracle. He was a powerful man who had been duped, and the target of his fury was sitting just a few feet away, in the heart of his home. With a guttural roar, he surged to his feet, the shards of glass crunching under his expensive shoes. He burst into the playroom, his presence a violent explosion of energy that shattered the tranquil atmosphere. Lily recoiled instantly, a terrified gasp escaping her lips as she scrambled away from Elena, curling into a tight ball in the corner of the room. The fragile bridge of trust, so painstakingly built, was gone, incinerated in the fire of his entrance. Alistair's face was a mask of contorted fury, his eyes those chips of cold steel, now burning with a paranoid fire. He pointed a trembling finger at Elena, his voice a low, dangerous snarl that vibrated with accusation. He demanded to know what she had done, what she had said to his daughter. He accused her of witchcraft, of manipulation, of using some unknown and unsanctioned method to trick a response from a sick child. He didn't see a healer, he saw a saboteur. He saw a threat to his control, a challenge to his authority within his own fortress, and his entire being recoiled from it with a primal, territorial violence. His world had been destabilized, and he would restore order by any means necessary, starting with the immediate and brutal removal of the anomaly. Elena rose to her feet slowly, her movements measured and deliberate, a stark contrast to his frantic, uncontrolled rage. She placed herself subtly between Alistair and the corner, where Lily was now trembling, a silent, instinctual act of protection. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable, but inside, a cold, clear current of understanding was beginning to flow. She had seen this kind of reaction before, in textbooks and clinical studies. The narcissistic rage of a parent unable to accept a reality that did not center them. She tried to speak, her voice even, and professional, attempting to explain the methodology, to de-escalate the situation. She told him it was not a trick, but a technique based on trust and non-verbal cues, a process of creating a safe space where language was not a demand but an invitation. She tried to tell him that Lily was not broken, but was a child who had built a wall for a reason, and that the only way to breach it was with patience, not force. But her words were like pebbles thrown against a hurricane. They were meaningless to him, nothing more than the pathetic justifications of a charlatan caught in the act. He laughed, a harsh, barking sound utterly devoid of humor. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated contempt. He took a step closer, invading her personal space, forcing her to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. He told her that he did not pay her to conduct her little social experiments on his daughter. He informed her that her employment was terminated, effective immediately. He wanted her out of his home, out of his sight, scrubbed from his life as if she had never existed. He spat the words at her, each one a polished stone of cruelty. He told her to pack her insignificant belongings and be gone within the hour, warning her that if she ever tried to contact his daughter or his family again, he would use the full weight of his legal team to crush her, to ensure she never worked in this city again. He was a king banishing a peasant from his court, his power absolute, his decree final. And as he stood there, basking in the momentary restoration of his own authority, his arrogance led him to make his second, and most catastrophic, mistake of the day. To punctuate his victory, to rub salt in the wound of her dismissal, he began to boast. His chest puffed out, and a sneer twisted his lips as he talked about the future, a future she would have no part in. He spoke of Finch Pharma, of his real power, the power to change the world not with whispers and blocks, but with science and capital. He mentioned that they were on the cusp of releasing a revolutionary new pediatric behavioral drug, a blockbuster medication that would solve problems like Lily's with a simple, daily dose. It would make them billions, he said, and it was all built on some outdated, dusty research they had acquired years ago. He waved his hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. He said it came from some small, forgotten clinic, a place run by some idealistic fool who didn't understand the business of progress. He even said the name, the words dripping with the casual disdain of a conqueror speaking of a vanquished territory. "The Vance Institute for Pediatric Wellness," he said, and then he chuckled, adding, "Never even heard of it before we bought their assets for pennies on the dollar." For Elena, the world stopped. It did not tilt or spin as it had for Alistair. It simply ceased all motion, freezing into a single, crystalline moment of horrifying clarity. The name. The Vance Institute. Her father's clinic. The words echoed in the sudden, dead silence of her mind, not as an insult, but as a confession. The casual, throwaway line, spoken from the heights of his arrogance, was the missing piece of a puzzle she had been living inside for 5 agonizing years. The hostile acquisition, the stolen research, the financial ruin that had led directly to the massive, stress-induced stroke that had shattered her father's brilliant mind and left him a ghost in a hospital bed. It was all him. The man standing before her, the man whose child she had just coaxed a word from, was the architect of her family's destruction. A wave of nausea, cold and acidic, rose in her throat. The image of her father, frail and confused, superimposed itself over Alistair's sneering face. The grief and rage she had suppressed for so long did not erupt. Instead, they fused together, deep in her core, into something cold, dense, and unbreakable. Her mission, which moments ago had been the simple, noble goal of helping a child, was instantly and irrevocably transformed. This was no longer about a job or a breakthrough. This was about justice, a cold, methodical, and total reckoning. Her external composure did not crack. To Alistair, she was just a fired maid, stunned into silence by his power. He saw her stillness as submission, her pale face as a sign of defeat. He had no concept of the tectonic shift that had just occurred within her, no idea that he had just handed a weapon of immense power to the very person he sought to discard. He gave a final, satisfied nod, the matter concluded in his mind. He turned his back on her, a gesture of ultimate dismissal, and walked toward the corner where Lily was still huddled, his attention already shifting to the next problem to be managed. He did not see the change in Elena's eyes. He did not see the grief harden into resolve, the shock sharpen into a diamond-hard focus. He did not feel the temperature in the room drop as her quiet fury settled over her like a shroud of ice. He thought he had won, that he had excised the problem. He could not have been more wrong. He had just armed his executioner, and he had done it with his own words, blissfully unaware that the quiet governess he had just fired was no longer a servant, but a judge who had just heard the final piece of evidence needed to sign his death warrant. Elena did not say another word. There was nothing left to say to him. She turned, her movements fluid and controlled, and walked out of the playroom, leaving him to deal with the crying child whose brief, miraculous moment of connection he had so thoroughly destroyed. She moved through the opulent hallway, her footsteps making no sound on the plush runners. The beautiful, expensive objects that filled the penthouse, the modern art, the designer furniture, the sweeping views of the city, were no longer symbols of a world she couldn't have. They were now exhibits in a crime scene, the ill-gotten gains of a man who had built his empire on the ruins of her family's life. Every gleaming surface seemed tainted. Every shadow seemed to hold the ghost of her father's stolen legacy. She felt a profound, chilling sense of purpose settle over her. The fear for her future, the anxiety over her father's bills, all of it was burned away by the white-hot intensity of her new resolve. He had taken her father's voice, his life's work, and his health. Now she would use that very same work to take everything from him. It was a perfect, terrible symmetry. She gathered her few belongings from the small, sterile room she was allotted near the service entrance. A few changes of clothes, a handful of textbooks she had kept hidden, a worn photograph of her and her father standing proudly in front of his clinic, their faces bright with hope. She looked at the photograph for a long moment, tracing the outline of her father's smiling face with her finger. It was not a moment of sadness, but of quiet communion, a silent vow made to the man in the picture. She would not let his name be forgotten. She would not let his work be used to enrich the very man who had destroyed him. She would reclaim his legacy, and she would do it by dismantling Alistair Finch's world, piece by piece, using the very tools of intellect and empathy that he so thoroughly despised. The fight was no longer about survival. It was about restoration. It was about honoring the memory of a brilliant, gentle man whose only crime was that he had created something beautiful that a powerful man had wanted to possess. As she rode the silent, private elevator down from the penthouse, the city lights rushing up to meet her, she felt not despair, but a strange and potent sense of liberation. She had been cast out of the gilded cage, but she was no longer a prisoner of her circumstances. The gray uniform felt like a skin she was shedding, the role of the invisible servant, a costume she was leaving behind forever. When the elevator doors opened onto the opulent, marble-lined lobby, she did not scurry out through the service exit as she usually did. She walked straight out the main entrance, her head held high, her posture erect. The doorman, accustomed to seeing her as a fleeting shadow, looked at her with a flicker of surprise. He saw not a fired governess, but a woman walking with the unshakable confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going. The cool night air of the city hit her face, a welcome shock after the sterile, recycled atmosphere of the penthouse. It felt real, alive, and full of possibility. She was unemployed, her future uncertain, but she had something far more valuable than a job. She had a target. She walked through the bustling city streets, the sounds of traffic and people, a welcome cacophony, after the oppressive silence of her former workplace. The faces of the strangers passing by were a reminder of the world outside of Alistair Finch's orbit, a world of ordinary struggles and triumphs, a world her father had dedicated his life to serving. The injustice of it all fueled her steps, each stride more determined than the last. She was no longer just Elena Vance, the overqualified governess. She was the keeper of a legacy, the sole heir to a body of work that had been stolen and perverted. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, her fingers scrolling through her contacts until she found a name she had not called in years. It was a name from her past, from the life that had been stolen from her. Professor Alistair Davies, her former mentor at the university, a man who had revered her father and had been one of the few who understood the true, revolutionary potential of his work. He was a man who valued academic integrity and truth above all else. He was the first piece of her new strategy, the first ally in a war that Alistair Finch didn't even know had been declared. Her finger hovered over the call button for a single hesitant moment. This was it. This was the point of no return. Making this call was an act of aggression, the first shot fired in a campaign that would require all of her intellect, all of her courage, and all of her resolve. She thought of Lily, alone in that cold fortress, her newfound voice likely already silenced again by fear. She thought of her father, lying in a quiet room, his memories and brilliance trapped behind a fog of neurological damage. She thought of Alistair Finch, high in his tower, believing he was untouchable, secure in his power and his wealth. A fire ignited in her chest, a righteous and unquenchable flame. Her hesitation vanished, replaced by a certainty so absolute it felt like destiny. She pressed the button, the familiar sound of the phone ringing in her ear, a clarion call to battle. When the professor's warm, academic voice answered on the other end, her own voice was steady, calm, and clear, imbued with a newfound authority that would have been unrecognizable to the man who had fired her just an hour before. "Professor Davies," she began. "It's Elena Vance. I need your help. I have something to show you, something that proves my father's work was stolen. And I know exactly who did it." The initial conversation was a torrent of information, a flood of pent-up knowledge and recently uncovered truths that Elena had held back for years. She spoke with a precision and clarity that immediately captured her former mentor's attention, the years of her academic training rising to the surface as if they had never been dormant. She laid out the facts as she knew them, connecting the dots between her father's financial ruin, the specifics of his research, and the arrogant confession she had just heard from the lips of Alistair Finch. Professor Davies listened in stunned silence on the other end of the line, the occasional sharp intake of breath, the only sign of his growing shock and outrage. He remembered her father well, not just as a colleague, but as a visionary whose gentle, empathetic approach to child psychology was a beacon of light in a field increasingly dominated by pharmaceuticals and impersonal diagnostics. The idea that his life's work had been plundered to create a commercial drug by a corporate predator like Finch was an academic and moral sacrilege. As Elena spoke, she could feel the weight of her isolation beginning to lift, replaced by the tentative strength of a new alliance. Professor Davies was more than just an old teacher. He was a gatekeeper to the world she had been forced to abandon. He had access to academic archives, to unpublished papers, to a network of professionals who respected the Vance name and would be horrified by what had been done to it. He immediately understood the gravity of her claim and the danger of challenging a man like Alistair Finch. He warned her of the risks, of the legal power Finch could bring to bear, but there was no caution in his tone, only a shared sense of indignation. He told her to come to his office at the university first thing in the morning. He would begin digging through the university's digital archives immediately, searching for the preliminary research proposals and grant applications her father had filed years ago. These documents, he explained, would serve as a crucial time-stamped record of her father's original intellectual property, a foundational piece of evidence that would predate any patent filed by Finch Pharma. Hanging up the phone, Elena stood for a moment under the orange glow of a streetlight, the city humming around her like a living entity. The first step had been taken. The machinery of justice, long dormant, was beginning to grind into motion. She was no longer just a grieving daughter with a secret. She was an investigator, a strategist, the leader of a two-person insurgency against a corporate empire. She looked up at the distant, glittering towers of the financial district, one of which held Finch's penthouse at its very peak. It no longer seemed like an unassailable fortress. It was a target. A cold, analytical part of her brain, the part that had excelled in research and data analysis, began to whir to life. She would need more than just her father's old papers. She would need to understand Finch's business, the structure of the acquisition, the timeline of the drug's development. She would need to find a weakness in his armor, a crack in the corporate facade that she could exploit. The governess was gone, and in her place stood a researcher with a very specific, very personal project. Her journey home was not to a comfortable apartment, but to a small, cramped room she rented in a shared house in a distant, far less glamorous part of the city. The contrast between this reality and the sterile opulence of the Finch penthouse was a visceral reminder of what had been taken from her. The smell of her neighbor's cooking, the sound of a television through the thin walls, the worn-out carpet under her feet, these were the details of a life lived on the margins, a life dictated by the financial devastation Finch had wrought. But tonight, the cramped room did not feel like a prison. It felt like a war room. She cleared the small desk, pushing aside bills and old paperbacks, and opened her laptop. The screen cast a pale blue light on her face, illuminating the fierce determination in her eyes. For the rest of the night, she did not sleep. She worked, fueled by coffee and a righteous fury that was sharper and more potent than any stimulant. She began to build a digital fortress of her own, a meticulously organized collection of files, timelines, and potential leads. She started with the public record, scouring financial news archives, shareholder reports, and press releases from Finch Pharma dating back a decade. Her eyes scanned the dense corporate jargon, her mind translating the sanitized language of mergers and acquisitions into the brutal reality of what had happened. She found it. A small article in a business journal from 5 years ago, announcing Finch Pharma's acquisition of a portfolio of distressed assets from several small independent research firms. The Vance Institute was listed among them, a footnote in a story about corporate expansion. The article praised Alistair Finch for his shrewd business acumen, his ability to identify and absorb undervalued intellectual property. Reading the words, Elena felt a bitter taste in her mouth. They called it shrewd business. She called it grave robbing. But within the article was a name, a junior executive at Finch Pharma who was quoted about the seamless integration of the new research assets. A potential weak link, a person who might have seen the original files. A name to be filed away for later. Next, she turned her attention to the drug itself. Finch had been vague, but he had given her enough. A pediatric behavioral drug. She began searching Finch Pharma's pipeline, their recent patent filings, and the chatter on pharmaceutical industry message boards. It took hours of cross-referencing and educated guesswork, but she eventually found it, a drug codenamed Serenalux, currently in the final stages of clinical trials. Its stated purpose was to treat severe anxiety-based communication disorders in children, including selective mutism. The description of its mechanism of action, though cloaked in complex pharmacological terms, hinted at a philosophy that was a grotesque perversion of her father's work. Her father had sought to understand and heal the root cause of a child's silence. Finch's drug sought only to chemically suppress the symptoms. It was a chemical straitjacket for the mind, a profitable, marketable solution that bypassed the difficult human work of connection and trust. Seeing her father's gentle, holistic methods twisted into a pill to be sold for profit solidified her resolve into something harder than granite. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep through her window, painting the city in shades of steel and slate, Elena had assembled the skeleton of her case. She had a timeline of the acquisition, the name of the drug, and a potential insider. She had a powerful ally in Professor Davies, who was, at that very moment, likely unearthing the academic proof of her father's authorship. She felt a profound exhaustion in her bones, the physical toll of a sleepless night, and a day of extreme emotional upheaval. But beneath the exhaustion was a deep, thrumming current of energy. She was no longer a victim of Alistair Finch's world. She was an active, dangerous threat to it. She had been invisible to him, a piece of the furniture, and that invisibility was now her greatest weapon. He would not see her coming. He would be looking for threats from his competitors, from regulators, from the sharks who swam in his own corporate waters. He would never, in his wildest, most arrogant dreams, think to look down to the fired governess he had so carelessly dismissed. He had cast her out of his ivory tower, but he had forgotten that from the ground, you have the clearest view of a building's foundations and the perfect position from which to plant the explosives. The meeting took place in a world Elena had thought was lost to her forever. The university library was a cathedral of quiet contemplation, its air thick with the scent of aging paper, lemon-scented wood polish, and the faint, dusty perfume of knowledge accumulated over centuries. Sunlight streamed through tall, arched windows, illuminating swirling dust motes like tiny golden nebulae in the hallowed silence. It was a stark, almost painful contrast to the cold, sterile atmosphere of Finch's penthouse, where the only smell was of chemical cleaners, and the only light was the cold, blue-white glare of modern fixtures. Here, surrounded by the gentle rustle of turning pages and the soft footsteps of students on worn oak floors, Elena felt a part of her soul, long dormant, stir to life. This was her natural habitat, the world she had been born to inherit, a world of ideas and inquiry, and returning to it now, not as a student, but as a warrior, filled her with a profound and sorrowful sense of purpose. The grief for her lost future was a sharp ache in her chest, but it was now intertwined with the steel of her new resolve. She was no longer mourning what was lost. She was fighting to reclaim it, and this hallowed ground was her first base of operations. Professor Davies had not changed. His office was the same controlled chaos she remembered, a small, book-lined cavern overflowing with precariously stacked journals, geological survey maps, and artifacts from his anthropological digs. He still had the same kind of intellectual energy that seemed to make the very air around him vibrate with curiosity. But as he looked at her across his cluttered desk, his usually warm, inquisitive eyes were filled with a cold, simmering anger. He had spent the night in the university's digital archives, and the evidence he had unearthed was laid out on the desk between them. A series of time-stamped research proposals and grant applications, all submitted by her father years before the acquisition. Each document was a ghost, a perfect digital fingerprint of her father's mind, detailing the foundational principles of his nonverbal therapeutic methodology with an academic rigor and elegant clarity that was unmistakably his. The professor's finger tapped on a specific date on a monitor, a submission made a full 2 years before Finch Pharma had even registered the patents for Serenolux. It was the smoking gun, the irrefutable proof of intellectual authorship. It was a monumental victory. Yet for Elena, it felt like only the first, small step in a much longer, more treacherous journey. The professor, a man accustomed to the civilized combat of academic debate, was already thinking several moves ahead in this far more dangerous game. He explained, his voice low and serious, that while they had proof of authorship, they lacked proof of intent. Finch's legal team, a veritable army of the best corporate lawyers money could buy, would argue that this was a case of parallel development, or that the acquisition of the clinic's assets legally transferred all intellectual property, published or not. They would drown them in legal motions, bury them in discovery requests, and bleed Elena dry long before the case ever saw the inside of a courtroom. To win, he argued, they needed more than a legal claim. They needed a narrative. They needed to prove, unequivocally, that Alistair Finch and his company had knowingly and deliberately targeted her father's research, stripped it of his name, and reverse-engineered its principles into a pharmaceutical product, all while understanding its true origin. They needed to find a witness, someone from inside the corporate machine who had seen the gears turning and could testify to the theft. He looked at Elena, his expression a mixture of concern and admiration. He was offering not just his help, but his strategic mind, becoming the first general in her nascent army. Elena's mind immediately flashed back to the small article she had found, the one that had praised Finch's shrewd business acumen. She recalled the name of the junior executive quoted in the piece, a man named Marcus Thorne. It was a long shot, a name plucked from the digital ether, but it was the only thread she had to pull. The task before her seemed monumental. How could she, a woman with a dwindling bank account and the professional status of a disgraced governess, possibly get a meeting with an executive at a multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical company? The power imbalance was a chasm, a vast yawning gap that seemed impossible to cross. For a moment, the familiar cold knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. The sheer scale of Finch's power, the monolithic, impenetrable fortress of his corporation, threatened to overwhelm her. But then she looked at her father's name on the document spread across the professor's desk, and the fear was incinerated by the white-hot flame of her fury. She would not be intimidated. She would use the same tools her father had taught her: observation, patience, and a deep understanding of human nature. Finch and his executives were just people, and every person, no matter how powerful, had a weakness. The next few days were a masterclass in quiet, relentless investigation. Elena transformed her small, cramped room into a strategic command center. Using the university's alumni database, which Professor Davies had granted her access to, she began to build a detailed profile of Marcus Thorne. She mapped his career trajectory, his educational background, his professional connections. She discovered he had left Finch Pharma 2 years after the acquisition, moving to a smaller, rival biotech firm. This was a crucial piece of information. It meant he was no longer under Finch's direct control, no longer bound by a corporate code of silence. It suggested a possible dissatisfaction, a reason for his departure that might make him more receptive to her story. She spent hours crafting the perfect message, a carefully worded email that was professional, respectful, and intriguing without being alarming. She didn't mention her father or the stolen research directly. Instead, she presented herself as an independent researcher working on a historical case study of early-stage biotech acquisitions, citing his name from the old article and requesting a brief, informal interview about his experiences at Finch Pharma during that specific time period. It was a calculated risk, a baited hook cast into the murky waters of the corporate world. The wait for a response was excruciating. Each passing hour felt like a lifetime, the silence in her inbox a deafening roar of potential failure. She filled the time with more research, diving deeper into the corporate structure of Finch Pharma, learning the names of the board members, the key stakeholders, the scientists who had been assigned to the Serenolux project. She was arming herself with knowledge, building an arsenal of facts that would allow her to speak Finch's own language back to him when the time came. She visited her father, sitting by his bedside in the quiet, sterile room of the care facility. She read to him from his old journals, her voice steady as she spoke his own brilliant words back to him. Though he could not respond, she felt his presence, his quiet strength, fueling her determination. She promised him, in a soft whisper that only he could hear, that his name would be honored, that his legacy would be restored. These visits were both a source of profound pain and a vital reminder of the stakes. Every time she looked at his vacant eyes, the fire of her resolve burned hotter. She was not just fighting for an idea, she was fighting for the man who sat silently before her. Just as she was beginning to lose hope, a reply appeared in her inbox. It was from Marcus Thorne. The message was brief, cautious, and non-committal. He agreed to a short meeting, but not at his office. He suggested a public, neutral location, a small, independent coffee shop in a part of the city far from both of their respective workplaces. The cautious tone of his reply told Elena everything she needed to know. He was wary. He was intrigued. He was a man with something to say, but he was afraid of the consequences of saying it. This was her opening. The dead end had given way to a narrow, uncertain path, and she knew she had to tread it with the utmost care. This meeting would be the most important performance of her life. She could not afford a single misstep. She had to build a rapport, establish trust, and convince a complete stranger to risk his career and his reputation to help her challenge one of the most powerful men in the city. The pressure was immense, but Elena felt a strange, cold calm settle over her. She had spent years mastering the art of nonverbal communication, of reading the subtle cues of fear and trust in a silent child. Now she would apply those same skills to a corporate executive. The coffee shop was a carefully chosen battlefield. It was loud and anonymous, the air filled with the hiss of an espresso machine and the low murmur of dozens of conversations, providing a cloak of ambient noise for their clandestine meeting. Elena arrived early, choosing a small table in a dimly lit corner, a place that offered a degree of privacy without seeming overtly secretive. When Marcus Thorne arrived, he looked exactly like the kind of man who would be haunted by his past. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, but his eyes were weary, and his shoulders were hunched with a tension that his expensive clothing could not conceal. He had the perpetually anxious look of someone who knew where the bodies were buried because he had been forced to help dig the graves. He was a man trapped between his ambition and his conscience, and Elena knew instantly that her father's story would resonate with the latter. She began the conversation just as she had planned, sticking to her cover story about the academic case study, asking him general questions about the corporate culture at Finch Pharma. As he spoke, his initial caution slowly began to erode, replaced by a tide of long-suppressed resentment. He described Alistair Finch not as a brilliant CEO, but as a corporate predator, a man who saw innovation, not as something to be created, but as something to be conquered and consumed. He spoke of a culture of fear, of ruthless efficiency, where human cost was never entered into the equation, Elena listened patiently, her expression one of empathetic understanding, gently guiding the conversation closer to the specific acquisition of the small research clinics. She observed the subtle shift in his body language, the way he broke eye contact, the nervous tapping of his fingers on his coffee cup when she finally mentioned the name of her father's institute. It was a clear and unmistakable sign of distress. He remembered, he knew. The foundation of trust had been laid, and now it was time to reveal the true purpose of their meeting. Taking a deep breath, she abandoned her pretense. Her voice dropped, losing its academic detachment and taking on a new tone of quiet, personal intensity. She told him who she was. She told him about her father, about his groundbreaking work, about the stroke that had stolen his voice and his life. She laid out the timeline, connecting the dots between the acquisition he had helped oversee and the personal devastation it had caused her family. She did not raise her voice. She did not make accusations. She simply told the truth, her words precise and measured, each one landing with the weight of undeniable fact. She watched as the color drained from Marcus Thorne's face, his professional mask crumbling to reveal the raw human emotion beneath. He stared at her, his mouth slightly agape, a look of dawning horror in his eyes. He was not just a witness to a corporate crime. He was, in that moment, a man forced to confront the real human consequence of his own actions and his own silence. The ghost of her father was sitting at the table with them, and his presence was impossible to ignore. A long, heavy silence stretched between them, thick with the unspoken weight of 5 years of injustice. Marcus finally broke it, his voice barely a whisper. He confessed that the Vance Institute acquisition had always bothered him. He told her that he had been the one tasked with reviewing the clinic's research files before the purchase. He remembered being stunned by the brilliance and the humanity of what he had read, recognizing that it was a revolutionary approach that could change the lives of thousands of children. He had even argued to his superiors, including Alistair Finch himself, that they should try to partner with the clinic to fund its work and bring its founder on board. He described how Finch had laughed at the suggestion, dismissing her father as an idealistic fool who didn't understand how to monetize his own genius. Finch's plan was never to partner, it was to plunder. He wanted the research, but he didn't want the man who created it. He wanted the asset, not the originator. It was cheaper, cleaner, and left no one to argue about credit or ethics. Marcus Thorne, his face a portrait of shame and regret, then provided Elena with the weapon she so desperately needed. He told her that before he left the company, he had made a personal, unauthorized backup of the initial acquisition assessment files. He had done it out of a vague sense of unease, a premonition that something deeply unethical was happening. Those files, he explained, contained the internal memos, the email chains between Finch and his legal team, and the initial scientific review of her father's work. They were the undeniable corporate proof, a digital paper trail that led directly to Alistair Finch's desk, proving that he knew exactly what he was taking, and had deliberately conspired to erase her father's name from his own discovery. He agreed to give her the files. It was an act of profound personal and professional risk, a rebellion against the man and the system that had compromised his own integrity. For Marcus, it was a chance at redemption. For Elena, it was the key that would unlock the gates of Finch's fortress. Leaving the coffee shop, a small, encrypted flash drive clutched in her hand, Elena felt as though she were walking on air. The city streets, once a landscape of her struggle, now seemed to be humming with a new and powerful energy. She had the academic proof from Professor Davies. She now had the corporate proof from Marcus Thorne. She had the what, and she had the how. The case against Alistair Finch was no longer a matter of personal conviction. It was a structure of verifiable, irrefutable fact. She could take this to a lawyer, to a journalist, and she would have a powerful, compelling story. But as she walked, a new, more audacious idea began to form in her mind. A lawsuit would take years. An article could be dismissed as a disgruntled employee's revenge. Finch was a master of public relations, a virtuoso of spinning narratives to his advantage. She realized that to truly defeat him, to truly achieve the justice her father deserved, she couldn't just expose his crime. She had to do it in a way that was so public, so dramatic, and so emotionally devastating that he would have no way to escape the fallout. She needed more than just evidence. She needed a spectacle. She needed to confront him not in a courtroom or in the pages of a newspaper, but in his own arena, on his own stage, in front of the very people whose respect and admiration he craved above all else. Her mind raced, sifting through the research she had done on his company. And then she found it. The Finch Pharma annual shareholder meeting. It was scheduled to take place in just 3 weeks. It was the company's biggest event of the year, a highly publicized affair where Alistair Finch himself would take the stage to unveil his latest triumphs to his investors, his board members, and the international press. And the centerpiece of this year's presentation, the star of the show, was to be the launch of their revolutionary new pediatric behavioral drug, Serenalux. The irony was so perfect, so poetically just, that it sent a shiver down her spine. He was planning to take a victory lap for the very crime he had committed, and she would be there to turn his coronation into an execution. The plan began to crystallize in her mind, a complex and daring strategy that would require perfect timing and nerves of steel. She would not just present the evidence of the theft. She would demonstrate the superiority of the original. She would show them the stolen art, and then she would show them the master at work. But to do that, she needed one final, crucial piece of evidence. She needed to show the world what her father's methods could actually achieve. She needed to show them Lily. The thought was a painful one. The last thing she wanted was to exploit a vulnerable child, to turn her therapeutic breakthrough into a piece of evidence in a corporate war. But then she thought of Lily, alone in that cold, sterile penthouse, her brief moment of connection shattered, her voice likely silenced once more by her father's toxic rage. Helping Lily was the reason this all began. Showing the world that a child's silence could be unlocked with empathy, not with a pill, was not an act of exploitation. It was an act of liberation, both for Lily and for the countless other children who would be subjected to Finch's chemical solution. It was the only way to honor both her father's work and the child who had become its most important beneficiary. The challenge, however, seemed insurmountable. She was banned from the penthouse, forbidden from ever contacting the family again. Alistair Finch's home was a fortress, his daughter a prisoner within it. Any direct attempt to approach them would result in her immediate arrest. She spent a day racking her brain, exploring every possibility, hitting one dead end after another. The solution, when it came, was not from a stroke of genius, but from a simple, remembered observation from her time as a governess. She remembered Lily's strict, unchanging weekly schedule. Every Tuesday afternoon, like clockwork, a different nanny, a stern, older woman with no patience for play, would take Lily to a small, exclusive private park a few blocks from the penthouse. It was a brief, joyless excursion, a box to be ticked on a schedule. But it was a predictable vulnerability in an otherwise impenetrable routine. It was her only chance. She would not be able to speak to Lily, but she might be able to see her. And if she could see her, she might be able to create her final, devastating piece of evidence. The following Tuesday, Elena put her plan into action. She disguised herself, not in a dramatic costume, but in the simple, effective camouflage of urban anonymity. A baseball cap pulled down low, a pair of oversized sunglasses, a nondescript jacket. She was just another face in the crowd, another person sitting on a park bench, scrolling through her phone. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she saw them arrive, the stern nanny, pulling Lily along by the hand, her small face a mask of resigned indifference. Lily was silent, withdrawn. The spark that Elena had briefly ignited, seemingly extinguished. Seeing her like this, a prisoner of her father's world, strengthened Elena's resolve. This was for her. Elena waited, her hands trembling slightly as she positioned her phone, its camera lens peeking out from behind a newspaper she held. She didn't call out Lily's name. She didn't try to get her attention. Instead, she did something only Lily would understand. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, smooth block of blue-painted wood, a twin to the one she had used in the playroom. She held it up, just for a moment, in Lily's line of sight. Lily's head snapped up, her eyes, which had been staring blankly at the ground, widened in recognition. A flicker of life, of memory passed across her face. She saw Elena, and for a heart-stopping moment, Elena thought the child would cry out, would run to her, exposing her and ruining everything. But Lily did something far more powerful. A small, slow smile spread across her face, a genuine expression of joy that was utterly transformative. She looked from the block in Elena's hand back to her own nanny, who was distracted by her phone. Then, in a voice that was soft but clear enough for Elena's phone to capture, she spoke. She didn't say Elena's name. She said the word Elena had been teaching her, the word associated with the blue block, the word for the color of the sky. "Blue," Lily said, her voice a small, perfect miracle in the afternoon air. Then she pointed to a red ball a boy was playing with nearby. "Red." She pointed to the green grass. Green. She was not just speaking. She was using the language, applying the lessons, demonstrating the success of the method. Elena's camera captured it all, the smile, the words, the undeniable proof of a mind unlocked not by a drug, but by a human connection. Back in her small room, Elena watched the video again and again. The clip was short, less than a minute long, but its power was immense. It was the emotional core of her entire case, the living, breathing proof that would dismantle Alistair Finch's lies. She now had everything she needed. She had the academic documents that proved her father was the originator. She had the corporate memos that proved Finch was the thief. And now she had the video of Finch's own daughter, proving that the stolen method was not only real, but that it was a cure Finch had actively tried to suppress in his own home. The pieces were all in place. The strategy for the shareholder meeting was set. She would not be a heckler in the crowd. She would be a scheduled speaker. Professor Davies, with his esteemed reputation and connections within the academic and business communities, would petition the board for a short time slot, framing it as a presentation from a concerned academic about the ethical sourcing of intellectual property in their new drug. It was a long shot, but it was plausible enough that a board concerned with its public image might just grant it. A profound and chilling calm settled over Elena. The frantic energy of the investigation was over, replaced by the quiet focus of a soldier preparing for the final battle. She looked at the timeline she had mapped out on her wall, a complex web of names, dates, and evidence. It was a portrait of a crime, meticulously reconstructed. She thought of Alistair Finch, high in his penthouse, completely unaware of the storm that was about to break over his head. He was busy preparing for his greatest triumph, polishing his speech, reviewing the projected profits from the drug that was built on the ruins of her father's life. He had underestimated her at every turn. He saw a maid, a governess, an insignificant cog in his machine. He had never bothered to look deeper, to see the mind, the training, the grief-fueled determination that lay beneath the uniform. His arrogance, the very quality that had allowed him to commit his crime in the first place, had been his undoing. He had created his own nemesis, and she was now perfectly positioned, armed with undeniable truth, ready to bring his entire world crashing down around him. The stage was set. The trap was laid. All she had to do now was wait for the king to walk onto her chessboard. The final days leading up to the shareholder meeting were a study in controlled tension. Elena and Professor Davies worked tirelessly, refining their presentation, preparing for every possible contingency. They created a seamless narrative, a story that would begin with the academic brilliance of her father's original work, move to the cold, calculated corporate theft documented in Marcus Thorne's files, and culminate in the emotionally devastating video of Lily. They knew they would only have a few minutes, and every second had to be deployed with maximum impact. Elena rehearsed her speech endlessly, not to memorize it, but to internalize it, to be able to deliver it with a calm, unshakable authority that would command the attention of a room full of powerful, skeptical people. She was not just telling her story, she was reclaiming her father's voice, and she would not allow it to tremble. She was no longer the invisible governess. She was the living embodiment of a legacy, and she was about to step into the light. During this time, her thoughts often drifted to Lily. She worried about the child, trapped in that gilded cage with a father who was incapable of understanding her. But her worry was now tempered by a fierce protective hope. The plan she had set in motion was not just for her father, it was for Lily too. By exposing Finch, she was not just seeking justice, she was orchestrating a rescue. She was fighting to free Lily from a future where her emotions would be medicated into submission, her silence treated as a disease to be cured by a profitable pill. She was fighting for Lily's right to be understood, to be heard, to be healed, through the slow, patient, and deeply human methods her father had pioneered. This realization gave her an added layer of strength. She was not just an avenger, she was a protector, and the thought of Lily's future gave her the final, unshakable conviction she needed to see this through to its conclusion. On the morning of the meeting, Elena stood before the small mirror in her room. She was not wearing her old gray uniform, the symbol of her invisibility and oppression. She was dressed in a simple, professional dark suit, clothing that was both a sign of respect for the arena she was about to enter and an armor for the battle she was about to wage. She looked at her own reflection and saw a stranger looking back. The fear and uncertainty that had clouded her eyes for so long were gone, replaced by a clarity and focus that was almost frightening in its intensity. She saw the daughter of a brilliant man, a skilled psychologist in her own right, a strategist who had outmaneuvered a titan of industry. She was no longer a victim of circumstance. She was the architect of a reckoning. She picked up the small, encrypted flash drive from her desk. It felt impossibly heavy in her hand, a tiny object containing the power to dismantle an empire and restore a name. As she left her apartment and stepped out into the crisp morning air, the city seemed to hold its breath. The towering glass and steel skyscrapers of the financial district loomed before her, a modern-day Colosseum where she was about to face the emperor. She was walking into the heart of her enemy's power, a place where money was the only language spoken and morality was a liability. She had no fortune, no corporate army, no legal team at her back. She had only the truth, a brilliant mentor, a repentant insider, and the undeniable evidence of a little girl's voice. In Alistair Finch's world, she had nothing, but in the world of human decency and justice, she had everything. The hunt was over. The evidence was secured. The plan was in motion. The final confrontation was at hand, and Elena Vance walked toward it, not with fear, but with the cold, certain, and righteous fury of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose, and an entire legacy to win. The grand ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel was a universe unto itself, a self-contained galaxy of corporate power. The air was cool and smelled of industrial-grade coffee, expensive wool suits, and the faint, ozonic hum of 1,000 high-end electronics operating in unison. A vast, deep blue carpet, patterned with the subtle Finch Pharma logo, stretched out like a silent ocean, swallowing the sound of every footstep. Above, a constellation of recessed lighting cast a sterile, shadowless glow on the sea of faces, a homogeneous assembly of investors, board members, and journalists, all turned toward the stage with a kind of reverent attention. On that stage, under the full, unforgiving glare of the spotlights, stood Alistair Finch. He was in his element, a king addressing his court, his voice amplified to the level of a god's, resonating through the cavernous space. He spoke of profit margins and market penetration, of synergy and forward-thinking paradigms. He was a master of this language, a conductor of a symphony of wealth, and the audience was his rapt orchestra, hanging on every word, every confident gesture, every perfectly timed pause. For Elena, watching from the wings, the scene was a grotesque tableau of everything that was wrong with the world. a temple built to honor the very man who had desecrated her family's life. She felt no fear, only a profound, chilling focus, the calm of a sniper who has their target locked in their sights. Professor Davies, a man whose natural habitat was a dusty lecture hall, looked surprisingly at home on the corporate stage. His academic gravitas gave him an air of unimpeachable authority that even this crowd of capitalists seemed to respect. He spoke briefly, his voice calm and measured, introducing the next speaker as part of a special presentation on the ethical considerations of intellectual property acquisition, a topic the board had reluctantly approved to bolster its public image. When he said her name, Ms. Elena Vance, a ripple of confusion passed through the room. The name meant nothing to them. Alistair Finch, who had been basking in the glow of his own presentation, turned with an expression of mild irritation, expecting some dry academic to present a few boring slides, but when Elena stepped out from the wings and into the blinding light, his face froze. The blood drained from it, leaving a sickly, pale mask of disbelief. He saw not an academic, but the maid, the governess, the insignificant employee he had cast out of his home. His mind, so quick and decisive in the boardroom, stuttered, unable to process this impossible reality. For a fatal second, he was paralyzed by sheer cognitive dissonance, and in that second, Elena reached the podium, her hands steady as she adjusted the microphone. He opened his mouth, a protest forming on his lips, a command to security dying in his throat, but it was already too late. She had the stage. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the quiet, deferential tone he remembered. It was a voice that had been forged in the fire of her grief and tempered by the steel of her resolve. It was clear, resonant, and utterly devoid of fear. A voice that filled the vast ballroom and commanded the absolute, undivided attention of every person in it. She did not look at Alistair. She looked out at the audience, at the sea of powerful faces, and she began her story. She spoke of a brilliant gentleman, a pioneer in pediatric psychology, and as she spoke, the massive screen behind the stage, the same screen that had just been displaying Finch Pharma's soaring stock prices, flickered to life. It showed not charts and graphs, but scanned copies of her father's research proposals, his handwritten notes, the elegant academic proof of his genius. She pointed to the timestamps, the digital fingerprints that predated Finch Pharma's patents by years. She said his name, Dr. Robert Vance, and with that single act, she began the process of resurrecting a ghost, of giving a name and a face to the man whose work had been stolen and whose legacy had been erased. A low, uncertain murmur began to spread through the ballroom as the audience started to connect the dots, a growing sense of unease that the triumphant narrative they had been sold was built on a foundation of lies. Alistair's paralysis finally broke, replaced by a surge of pure, panicked fury. He stepped toward her, his hand raised, his face a contorted mask of rage. He hissed her name, ordering her to stop, to get off his stage. But Elena did not flinch. She simply turned her head and met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw not the timid servant he had fired, but a judge delivering a sentence. Before he could take another step, she advanced to the next slide, the screen now filled with the cold, hard text of internal corporate memos. Email chains between Alistair Finch and his legal team. The words were his own, a damning record of his crime, projected 40 feet high for the entire world to see. The audience read his casual dismissal of her father, his calculated plan to acquire the research for pennies on the dollar, his explicit instructions to his team to scrub the originator's credit, to ensure a clean patent filing. The murmuring in the room died instantly, replaced by a collective, sharp intake of breath. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum of shock and dawning horror. The board members on the front row stared at the screen, their faces ashen. The journalists began typing with a frantic, furious energy. Alistair Finch stood frozen in the middle of the stage, trapped in the spotlight, exposed and crucified by his own words, his own arrogance, his own crime. Then came the final, devastating blow. Elena's voice softened, filled with a sorrowful power as she spoke of the human cost of this theft. She spoke of a little girl, trapped in a fortress of silence, whose own father was about to market a chemical solution for a problem he refused to understand. She told the audience that the most important evidence of all was not on paper. The screen behind her changed one last time, and the ballroom was filled with the image of a sunlit park. The audience saw a small, beautiful girl with her father's eyes, a girl they all recognized as Lily Finch. And then they saw her smile, a genuine, radiant smile of pure joy. They heard her voice, a sound no one outside of that penthouse had heard in years, as clear and perfect as a bell. They heard her say blue. They heard her say red. They heard her say green. Elena's voiceover explained, with clinical precision, that this miracle was not the result of a prototype drug, but the direct application of Dr. Robert Vance's gentle, empathetic, and stolen methodology. The hypocrisy was a weapon, and she had just plunged it directly into the heart of Alistair Finch's empire. He stumbled backward, his hand flying to his mouth as if to stifle a cry, his eyes wide with the horror of a man watching his entire world burn to the ground on live television, his ruin delivered by the voice of his own child. Type justice in the comments if you got chills when Elena finally exposed the truth. The immediate aftermath was a symphony of chaos. The profound, shocked silence of the ballroom shattered into 1,000 pieces, erupting into a cacophony of shouted questions from the press, frantic whispers among the investors, and the furious, urgent voices of board members speaking into their phones. Alistair Finch remained on the stage, a statue at the center of the hurricane, his face a canvas of utter devastation. The mask of the corporate titan had not just cracked, it had disintegrated, revealing the small, panicked, and pathetic man beneath. He tried to speak, to offer a denial, but only a dry, croaking sound emerged from his throat. The power he had wielded his entire life, the power of his voice and his wealth, was gone, rendered impotent by the simple, undeniable truth. Security guards, who moments before would have moved to protect him, now stood uncertainly, looking to the ashen-faced board members for instructions. He was no longer a king. He was a liability. He was a disgraced man, alone in a spotlight that no longer illuminated his glory, but only his shame, his collapse so total and so public that it was a wound from which he would never recover. In the months that followed, the world shifted on its axis. Alistair Finch's empire crumbled with astonishing speed. Ousted by his own board, facing a maelstrom of lawsuits from shareholders and a federal investigation into securities fraud, he vanished from the public eye, his name becoming a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms across the globe. But as his world descended into darkness, Elena's was just beginning to dawn. The story of the governess who had toppled a corporate Goliath became a media sensation, a modern-day fable of David and Goliath. A rival pharmaceutical company, one with a reputation for ethical research, saw not just a story, but an opportunity. They offered Elena a position that was beyond her wildest dreams: to establish and lead a new, fully funded pediatric wellness division named the Dr. Robert Vance Institute. They gave her the resources, the platform, and the complete academic freedom to restore and expand upon her father's work, to bring his gentle, revolutionary methods to a world that desperately needed them. She moved her father from the sterile, state-funded facility into a world-class neurological rehabilitation center, a place of hope and healing, paid for by the first installment of the massive settlement she had won from the remnants of Finch Pharma. The final scene of this chapter of her life was not set in a boardroom or a laboratory, but on the sun-drenched grass of a city park. She was no longer an avenger, no longer a strategist, but simply a guardian, a friend. Beside her, on a blanket, sat Lily, her custody having been transferred to a compassionate relative with Elena granted full and frequent visitation rights. The child who had been a silent prisoner in a gilded cage was now chattering happily, pointing at a dog and forming a full, complex sentence to describe its fluffy tail. Elena watched her, a profound sense of peace settling over her for the first time in years. She had not just sought justice, she had created it. She had honored her father's memory, not by destroying a man, but by building something beautiful from the ashes of his legacy. She had given a voice back to a child who had lost hers, and in doing so, she had finally, truly, reclaimed her own. Her journey, born from the deepest personal tragedy, had become a testament to the enduring power of truth, the unshakable strength of a daughter's love, and the simple, world-changing fact that one small, determined voice, speaking with clarity and courage, can be loud enough to bring down an empire. If Elena's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell.